Welcome to Decoding the Law, a new and recurring forum series from the Washington State Bar Association on a variety of timely and relevant legal topics affecting our society. I'm Megan Scott, Education Programs Lead here at the WSBA, and our hope today is with Decoding the Law series is to connect the general public with the legal community and to help decode questions about the law. Today's session is going to explore race relations, police, and the law. This session will be available for replay on our website at www.wsba.org, and then be sure to also watch for information on our next topic in the Decoding the Law series on sexual harassment, which we'll do in early March, along with International Women's Day. We will be taking questions from the audience throughout the presentation today. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Webcast participants, please submit your questions to the moderator through the group chat feature. I will be there with you online, and I'll get to as many as time allows. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Bill Pickett. Bill Pickett has been WSBA's president-elect since July 2017, and he is a solo practitioner in Central Washington where he focuses his practice on trial advocacy in personal injury and wrongful death matters, civil rights and police misconduct, and medical malpractice. He is a member of the National Police Accountability Project, which monitors law enforcement misconduct across the country. Without further ado, I'm going to let Bill take over and give us some information about our wonderful panelists. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. It's a privilege to moderate this panel. I'm going to briefly introduce everybody, and then I'll start with a round of questions for each panelist. Be prepared. We're expecting questions from everybody in the audience. This is participatory. This is a no-holds-barred question and answer period. While we remain and will be committed to being respectful and honoring of one another, there is no question that would be considered inappropriate, and we would encourage everybody to open up and ask questions. To my right, we'll start with Norm Stamper. Norm is the SPD, former SPD chief from 94 to 2000. That's what Wikipedia tells me. He's got 34 years of policing expertise, so a boatload of time as a police officer. He holds a doctorate, I thought this was interesting, in leadership and human behavior. And then he is the author of the book Breaking Rank, A Top Cop's Expose to the Dark Side of American Policing. Whole series of interesting quotes to read about that book. I will not share them. You may share some of them later, Norm. Thank you for being here. To my immediate right is Sue Rahr. Sue is identified in one of the articles I wrote as the woman who is, what is she doing? She is retraining the order of law. I thought that was an interesting way to describe you.
The Time magazine.
Yes. She's a former King County sheriff. She is the director of the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. If you are a police officer in the state of Washington, with the exception of State Patrol, you likely came through that academy and learned how to be a police officer. Let's see, and she is also quoted as being a person who has identified this term, the guardians of our community, as opposed to the warriors of our community. And we'll talk more about that later. So, Sue, thank you for being here. And then to my immediate left is Michelle Storms. Michelle is a lawyer with the ACLU, former dean at the University of Washington Law School, dean for students. She is the 2015 Distinguished Service Award winner from WSBA's Civil Rights Law section. Very high honor. And this is what is said out there in internet land about Michelle. The integrity, and you don't hear, and I quote this because you just don't hear a lot of this about lawyers. But if you get to know Michelle, you'll know every word of this is true. The integrity, love, and joy she brings to the work and the people around her is a humbling reminder to us all. Rarely do you hear those words, integrity, love, and joy, in the same sentence as a lawyer. So it's an honor for you to be here with you, Michelle. I want to say welcome to each one of you, and we'll start with this question. Norm, it comes to you. We're here talking about the subject of race relations and policing. I know your background is in this idea, this concept called community policing. I'd like to know your thoughts on the intersection between community policing and race relations in that dynamic. Is there a role for community policing, or is community policing something that's come and gone? Just your thoughts.
Well, let's define community policing. I'm going to do it idiosyncratically, of course. I'm going to define community policing through my views, my vision, my values, and the research that I've done. I would also point out right at the beginning that as a San Diego Police Department lieutenant in 1971, I wrote the first grant for a demonstration project of the principles of community policing. I have to contest that distinction with Joe Brand, who is the executive director of Clinton's first office of community-oriented policing services. He maintains that when he was a lieutenant in Santa Ana, that's when community policing was born. But there are 1,001 different definitions of community policing. Here's mine. Community policing is the community policing itself. Full stop. The community policing itself. Of course, the community, a neighborhood, has partners involved in the effort to achieve public safety and honor human rights and civil liberties, and that partnership is critical. But the senior partner in that partnership rests, I think, with the citizenry. We had a successful demonstration project. We went citywide. A lot of our wonderful, lofty-sounding principles fell by the wayside within weeks or months. And certainly a few years later, many of us, myself included, were prepared to declare community policing dead, or at least dormant, and solidly so. And over the years, we found from different parts of the country, different thinkers, observers, from the citizenry, from within law enforcement, coming together, dusting off definitions of community policing. And over the years, I just want to say that I am more persuaded today than ever that what is desperately, indeed urgently needed in this society is that definition of community in the driver's seat, as opposed to the passenger seat, or, God forbid, the back seat. It makes no sense whatsoever in a free and democratic society, one that we know to be multicultural, that we believe to honor a pluralistic sensibility, for the citizens to engage community policing with the police department as a junior partner. Where does the role of race intersect? And by the way, I have lots of ideas about how citizens can be involved in policymaking, program development, crisis management. Imagine citizens co-planning, co-preparing, co-policing demonstrations. I wonder what might have happened in this city in 1999 had I had come to that sensibility and done the hard work, the heavy lifting necessary to have an authentic partnership between community and police. Citizens involved in the hiring decision, in promotion decisions, citizens involved, in short, in all aspects of police operations. I outline in my new book, which is called To Protect and Serve, How to Fix America's Police, somewhat presumptuous subtitle, but a way by which we can actually achieve full citizen participation in community policing. There's a group of people, a large, I think, group of people who have no interest in joining with their local police department in this partnership. I refer to those who have developed over time deep mistrust of law enforcement. Disproportionately represented by young people, poor people, and people of color. If, in fact, in a pluralistic society, in a free and democratic society, those voices matter, those citizens participating in this partnership matter, then we've got to find a way to drop some barriers. And one of them is to stop shooting so many of them. I just need to say, from my heart to yours, from my head to yours, that if you look at the roughly 1,000 police shootings that result in the death of a fellow American every year in this country, you will see a line of predictability and a line of preventability. And if that's true, shame on us for not coming together as Americans and saying we need to find a way to de-escalate. We need to find a way to make sure that every single police officer in this country values the sanctity of human life and demonstrates that value in his or her everyday practice. Of course there are people, I'll conclude my opening remarks with this. There are people who, when invited to join a partnership with their local police, have no interest in doing so because of their experience, because of the stories that have been told over the dinner table, not just for a few years, but literally for generations that date back to the antebellum slave patrols and night riders. I've talked to so many white cops who said, please don't talk to me about slavery. My daddy was not a slave owner. His daddy, not a slave owner. His daddy's daddy and his daddy's daddy's daddy, not a slave owner. So please, let's be relevant. Let's talk about today with zero appreciation of the truth, of the tradition, of the heritage as it is experienced in this country if you're not a white, and typically a white male. To not be able to understand or appreciate the role of white privilege or, God forbid, white supremacy. We have a long ways to go in this country, and I advocate a massive grassroots citizen movement that would influence everything from Congress and the presidency. We need to talk about that, and local law enforcement as well. Engaged in a partnership that is truly authentic. Thank you.
Thanks, Norm. Appreciate it. I was actually wondering who stole Norm Stamper and replaced him with you, because I was looking at your resume and I was thinking 34 years of policing, that doesn't sound like 34 years of policing, but that sounds like a whole lot of wisdom. So I thank you very much. And if that didn't generate comments, it should have, and you better be writing them down, because we're going to be coming back to Norm later to discuss some of the topics that he just raised. Sue.
Do I have to
All
follow
right,
him?
you do. Yours is a little different question, and it is really with regard to how we are training police officers today. I was down at the academy here last week, and I saw a long corridor of officers lined up. I saw a lot of white faces and mostly male, and so I know I'm sure there are strides that you are making to somehow change some of that, but I want to drill down a little bit with you specifically to the training of officers and the selection of who gets to be trained in regards to the issue of race in policing, as best you can.
Well, I can talk to you about the training. In our state, we have a single police academy that does the training for all 300 city and county police departments and a few others. We train everybody except the troopers. We do not do the hiring, so we basically take the recruits that are sent to us. So I would certainly be happy to have that conversation, but I'm not the one that does the selection. But I am the one that does the training. And I tell my friends and my colleagues, I spent 33 years in law enforcement. That was my preparation for what I'm doing now. Because as Norm said, with age comes wisdom, thank God. Some compensation for all the other bad things about getting older. But I have learned a lot of lessons, and those lessons inform some changes that we've made at the academy. And to try and make it very succinct, I have basically selected a motto for the academy, training the guardians of democracy, because I want to get the recruits focused on the Constitution, focused on freedom, focused on what their role is in maintaining our way of life. Unfortunately, popular culture portrays cops as the warriors. If you look at any police equipment publications, you would think you were looking at a military catalog. So we have this whole popular culture that reinforces the image of cops as warriors. We also have a political movement that started in the 70s, the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on freaking everything. And the cops were the ones in the front lines that were supposed to be fighting that war for us. So I don't want to blame it on the politicians. We were certainly willing participants, but I think we have to be mindful that this is not something that emerged just in the vacuum of law enforcement. We're in this together. So we started looking at the academy, how can we shift the mindset of our recruits early on, and so they start looking at themselves not as warriors, but as guardians. And I wrote a paper that was published by Harvard just shortly after Ferguson happened. I actually wrote the paper long before Ferguson happened. Nobody was interested in it until that blew up, and then suddenly people were interested in it. But I made a mistake by prefacing it, as moving from warriors to guardians, as if you have to choose one over the other. And what I really am trying to convey is we're talking to officers about their role. Their role is to be a guardian. They have to have warrior skills to carry out that role sometimes, because there are dangerous people in the community, and they do have to have those tough skills to be able to defend themselves and defend the community. So we really have to make that very clear, that you're not a warrior sometimes and a guardian other times. You're always a guardian, but you use your warrior skills when they are absolutely necessary. I also wanted our recruits to look at themselves as serving a higher purpose. I know we have a couple of cops in the room, and every cop I know coming in the door said, this is a calling. I want to do something good for the community. So my goal was to keep that intact. After 5 months of training them with warrior skills, I still wanted them to feel like they were serving a higher purpose, not out there to engage in battle. When somebody sees themselves serving a higher purpose, they are more likely to manage their behavior and their decision making. We can't make enough rules to ensure that cops don't make mistakes or don't do the wrong thing, because most of what they do, and Chief, I know you've experienced this, so much of it is based on personal judgment and discretion. And so in order to manage their discretion or influence their discretion, we need to get at their value system. And I think the best way to do that is to really talk about the mindset and the calling that they're serving. I find myself often having to defend this position by telling people being humane doesn't mean you're weak. Unfortunately, too many people think that's one or the other. And that's a message that we reinforce over and over again. I will challenge recruits by saying, are you courageous enough to be compassionate? And talk to officers about a smile is a tremendous tool. That is a de-escalation technique, is to just be a human being with other people. And I find, I have to be honest, my millennials coming in the door, I love these guys. I know most of my boomer colleagues, we like to make fun of the millennials and their text messaging and all that. But this generation of folks coming into policing, if you could all come and visit, we have, at the first week of the academy, we do Bio Day. And the recruits talk about what they did before becoming cops. And Norm, you would be so pleased to hear the kinds of people that are coming in the door, school teachers, psychologists, all kinds of different professions, as well as a lot of military veterans, which we can talk about that if it comes up, because military veterans, contrary to popular belief, are my best guardians. They know what it is to be a warrior. I had one recruit tell me, ma'am, I am done being a warrior. I want to be a cop because I'm ready to be a guardian. And so I would just say that really quickly in terms of the people coming in the door. I want to set this kind of a mindset for our recruits coming in the door because I want them to be open to the concept of harm reduction rather than just taking bad guys to jail. When I came up, as you did, Norm, I joined in the late 70s, it was all about arresting people. I believed with every fiber of my being that the more people I arrested, the safer the community was. I never thought beyond the booking desk. It's like, hey, I got them out of the community, I dump them in a jail, and something magic happens and they stop committing crimes. Very wrong-headed thinking, but unfortunately, for those communities where they're stats-driven and, counting arrests and things like that, that tends to perpetuate that. So we try to get our recruits to look at the bigger picture. Is your action going to make the community safer? Is arresting that young man and giving him a felony conviction and taking him away from his children, his wife, his girlfriend, whatever, is that going to make the community safer? Probably not, but we have to open their minds to look at the bigger picture and the people that the police department work for, the mayor, the city council, the county executive. Those folks often are asking for the statistics. So this is not just a police department endeavor. This is the whole bigger picture. So I think I'll stop at that and leave some time for questions. I could go on
Perfect.
for hours.
That raises about 24 questions.
Okay.
So, yeah, and hopefully our audience is ready to jump in. Thank you. Michelle, ACLU lawyer. All right. And I say that with respect, but I come from the other side of the hill, and sometimes we don't think good thoughts about the ACLU and kind of wonder what they're up to. Okay. But I want to hear your perspective for how you think we are doing. And when I say we, I mean inclusive. I'm including not only the police folks who do the training and the day-to-day operations, but as a society, how are we doing with regard to race relations in policing?
Well, thank you for the question. And thanks for all the folks who are here in the room. That's great. I really appreciate seeing that. I know there's people out in the world. So to talk about that, I want to step back and do a little context setting. I guess first I want to say at the ACLU, the things that we are really thinking about in the realm of policing relate to just a couple specific topics, right? Excessive use of force, racially biased policing, crisis intervention and what's happening in that realm. More recently, in particular, the ways in which law enforcement cooperates inappropriately with immigration services, and then also community oversight and the role of that sort of genuine, authentic community engagement with policing that Norm references a little bit. So those are some of the key things that we've been thinking about. So in order to think about race relations in policing, you also have to just sort of think about race relations writ large. And so, these areas of the policing that we look at, there are definitely places where there's racial tension. But if we kind of go back and look at our country and think about what are the structures that are in place, Norm has already really referenced this quite beautifully. We have a country that's founded on racism, so we have had forced removal of Native Americans, slavery and Jim Crow, immigration policies that absolutely disfavor black and brown people in that process and continues to be a source of difficulty in our country now in terms of our immigration laws. So these are some of the foundations. And even where we have laws, where we had laws that were discriminatory, maybe those laws are gone, but we still have the history and the production of what was created by those laws. And so we have then both explicit bias that has been present, and then we have implicit bias, which I know is something that you guys talk about at the Academy as well. So we also have those things that regardless of what we think about ourselves and the way we think and perceive other people, we have unconscious factors in play when we encounter folks who are different from ourselves in whatever way that is. And the work on implicit bias has been very deep and very scientific, and so we know for a fact that people have certain reactions toward people they perceive as having disabilities or having a mental health issue, and absolutely along racial lines. And doctors, for example, there's statistics that doctors give different service to African American people, right? So there's a lot of science behind that. So we have our explicit biases and we have our implicit biases. So now lay that on top of law enforcement, and what do you have? So if I, as just citizen X, am having a reaction to you in some sort of a way, I might hurt your feelings, there might be something you can do about it, but when I am someone with a gun in a tense situation, it could lead to death. And this is the very thing that we have seen happen, that Norm referenced. We have a radical problem with loss of life in black and brown communities at the hands of police. And so how do I think we're doing? We need to do a lot better than we're doing, okay? Some of the things that make a difference are when communities and police can partner together in a community policing model, when the training for police is affirmatively taking on these questions of explicit and implicit biases. And I know Sue's doing some great things, bringing people in the community to really talk with recruits about what their experiences are in the communities so that the officers can be trained with that. Those are some of the things that can make a So maybe I'll stop there. I'm sure I have a lot more to say, but we'll go with that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, we've got, I'm looking at the timer, and we've got 37 minutes here, so we are going to open it up for questions. We got a hand already, because if you don't ask a question, I'm going to ask one of mine, and my questions will not be as interesting as your questions. I can promise you that. So Lem has a question up front here. Do we need a microphone? And if you, when you want a question, raise your hand, and we will direct our microphone to you.
My question is to Norm Stamper. First, I want to say I identify and salute everything you've said in your opening statement, but I want to know when the epiphany occurred, because you were chief of police when a black man was, when his fiancee, his girlfriend, mother of his child, called his 911 because he was beating up on her, and he ran across an open yard and was hung up on a stanchion, and the officer took his gun and shot him 12 to 18 inches from his Adam's apple and killed him. And he was hung up on a stanchion and was no threat to anybody. And your police review board said that it was accidental and within police guidelines, and we know that it requires 8.5 pounds of pressure on the trigger of a Glock for it to go off. And you came to Mount Zion when there were about 720 of us there and said the shooting was unjustified. The next day, you got the police review board saying it was accidental and within police guidelines, and you sided with the cop, and he was not disciplined. So I want to know when the epiphany occurred and what your explanation is for that.
He actually was disciplined. The discipline was not punitive, however, it was corrective. And I'll look back on that and any number of other decisions that I've made over the course of my career and say, you know, if I had the benefit of the views that I have been able to acquire since leaving. I've been out of police work now for 17 years. But I remember that night very distinctly. I got the call in the middle of the morning. I was living in West Seattle. I drove across the high rise. I went to the scene. I talked to my homicide people. I brought in, over the ensuing days, a number of trainers who taught at the academy, who taught in service. And one of the things that I came to conclude, it's a conclusion that I hold to this day, is that the officer, Bill Edwards by name, it was certainly well publicized, was reaching for this man. And he had the gun in his hand. Utterly foolish, very reckless, very irresponsible. He reached for the man, and as he's seizing, the trigger, in fact, is pulled.
Balderdash.
What?
I was at the inquest, and he admitted he stood over the man and shot him right like that.
I heard and read the entire report of the inquest and did not hear that. So if you're hearing something...
I was there and questioned him and saw him demonstrate what he did.
And did he say that he shot him on purpose?
No, he didn't.
And
He said,
Yeah.
Let me say this. Hold on. Let me say this. The question to the chief is, when did he have the epiphany that really speaks to the things that you told us earlier about your thoughts on policing and community involvement, and that's active involvement, if you could speak to that.
I'd be happy to do that. And there's much more in the interest of time and everybody else's interest. I'll just
I'm
say
going to give you about 30 seconds.
that if you would like to follow up with this one-on-one, I'm happy to do it. Now, I believe that the police in America belong to the people, not the other way around. I believe that we are the people's. I can't stop saying we. And in the present tense, it's something about it. But we are the people's police. And as such, we have an obligation to protect human life and defend the civil liberties of every human being with whom we interact. I believe that in my heart of hearts, have believed that throughout all but the first 14 months on the job, where I systematically abused the people I had been hired to protect and serve. So it's not an epiphany. There are certain situations that I would do over differently today if I had that advantage, but I don't.
Thanks, Norm. Thanks, Lem. Next question, and we've got the mic to past President Anthony Geip.
Well, hello. Thank you all for being here. This question is directed to Norm and Sue, because the statistics on the number of minority officers in the pipeline for training is ridiculously low compared to the population at large. And it's always interesting to me, how can police forces crack that problem? Because you'll never have true community policing until the police look like the community.
I'll start with that. And you're absolutely right. It's been a constant source of frustration to me trying to understand what it would take. When I came through the academy in '79, there were 3 women in the class. Today, in 2017, we average between 2 and 5 women in every class of 30. So we haven't gotten much better. I can't speak to why minority candidates don't come to the table as often. I can speculate about that. And part of it, I think, is the way the job is characterized in popular culture. Again, it's the warriors, it's the tough, you got to do this, you got to do that. And since I do know that in the last couple of years, I've had a number of recruits say to me, I would have never thought about being a cop until I heard about what you guys are doing here at the academy. So it's a tiny step that we're starting to take. But I believe until popular culture changes a little bit, kids aren't from the age of 8 or 9 or 10 going to want to be a cop unless they visualize themselves doing that. I had a mother tell me, she wrote to me in my position at the academy, she said, my daughter wants to be a cop. And so for Halloween, I tried to get her a cop costume, which seems, like a fun thing to do. Her daughter, I think, was 6 years old. So she went on the internet and got a kid's cop costume, but it was a little boy wearing the costume. And her daughter said, well, I want to be a girl policeman, which was funny. And so the mom said, okay, girl police uniforms. And of course, you know what she got, the fishnets and the whips and chains and stuff like that. So we need to redefine what policing means in broader culture, I think, to attract more women to the job. I think we need more flexibility in the job. Right now, it's either full-time or nothing, and it's very difficult. The physical reality is many women choose to have babies, and it's very difficult to do that when you're wearing a gun belt. And so we need to have an option for women to take some time to do something different. For minority communities, my assumption is it's broken trust. And if my family doesn't respect this profession, I probably am not going to be drawn to that profession. But I think there are other people that could answer that better than I.
And maybe just to follow up really quickly, if you'll give me the privilege.
Yeah.
Is it toxic masculinity, back to you on that question? And then second, Michelle, do you agree with the assessment? Is that the problem?
Okay, hold on. Yeah, the question is it toxic masculinity contributing to this problem? And then to Michelle, whether do you agree or disagree with the assessment?
Right, with why minority communities
with why minority communities are not getting involved.
Right. I'm not sure what you mean by toxic masculinity. There's a huge variation from one police agency to another. Some are very macho, some not so much. I really think, though, it's on a broader scale of how the profession is perceived by young women who are deciding what they want to do for a career.
So funny, Anthony, before you asked that, I was thinking about this issue as I sit here, and broken trust certainly is a huge piece. I think, I can't speak on behalf of all minority communities or all minorities, but broken trust is real, right? So the sense that policing and racially biased policing is strong, and to try to think that you can go into policing and make change single-handedly as an individual who is from a minority community, people know that that's not highly likely. I think it probably will take a pretty huge redefinition of policing to have that interest among a lot of minority candidates when Norm talks about the idea of community policing as the community policing itself and an authentic partnership and a massive grassroots citizen movement. I can imagine that's a space in which we would see a much more diverse cadre of people wanting to be involved in that. But as it is currently constituted, I think that's partly why we have the problem.
Next questions. Okay. Here, and then we have just for here and here. Please.
Just on that last question, my name is Mahogany, Seattle born and raised. And again, not speaking for all minorities, but is anything being done to change the criteria for employment as a law enforcement officer? I'd offer that, I've got an MSW and 8 years of experience in nonprofit and government employment, but when it came down for me to apply to volunteer with the Seattle Police Department, there was this extensive list of things that would require me to check boxes that I was very disinterested in checking and discouraged from doing so, so I didn't even apply, and that was just to support victims specifically going through DV situations. So I can only imagine what that means on a broader scale.
Any members of the panel?
I agree with you. I think we have to step back, and again, we need to look more broadly than the police department itself, because police departments don't operate independently. And there are reasons that there are civil service questions and requirements like that, and I think it takes a broader push. Now, certainly there are some law enforcement agencies that like having all those boxes, but I think that there are many police leaders that would like to see those boxes go away.
Thank you. Here's a question right in front. And I forgot to remind everybody, Mahogany did a great job. Just state your name, please, and then your question.
Hi, my name is Melissa Varelli. I had a question about the community policing, either for Norm or Michelle, if you want to comment on it as well. I haven't read your book yet, but it definitely sounds like a compelling idea. The only thing I want to know about, or kind of gives me pause or comes top of mind, is when I have seen examples of community policing on websites such as Nextdoor or Reddit, it's often communities are policing themselves in with racial profiling and using racial stereotypes. So I'm wondering kind of how that is still seen as a solution, and maybe it's just a little bit better than what we have now, but it surely wouldn't be perfect.
Well, and that certainly does not line up with my definition of community policing. I see the community organizing, mobilizing, educating itself. I see the community making decisions that if the invitation to participate in police operations is not forthcoming, they demand a seat at the table. They demand that their voice be heard. I think it's important that we not allow ourselves to become victims, really, of timidity and of appreciation of how formidable the police bureaucracy may look to us. How am I going to make entrance? How am I going to even talk to anybody within the police department? For one thing, they speak a foreign language. I mean, oftentimes they're speaking in codes or other arcane languages, check boxes that were referenced earlier, that sort of thing. So I think it's vital that at the grassroots level, we begin to see larger and larger bodies of citizens coming together to press for the kind of change. I used to believe, one change that I've undergone in the past 17 years, that change of the type that I would envision and that I would certainly support can come from the police department or from the agency itself. I no longer believe that. I believe citizens or police officers are also part of that partnership. But in an institution that continues to make unilateral and arbitrary decisions time and time again, where collaboration would have been by far a preferable way to get buy-in from everybody, it's vital that citizens recognize their own power. By the way, I use citizens not I use it in a socio-political, not a legal fashion. The citizens of Ferguson, the citizenry of New York.
Thanks, Norm.
You bet.
Okay, I want to give Michelle an opportunity.
The only thing I would quickly say, and this really references both your comment and Mahogany's comment, is that the work that we have to do is really so deep and will take such a long time, because both of those comments and questions to me relate to the fact, again, that we're dealing with a situation where we have structural racism or structural racialization. We have systems and processes that continue to produce and reproduce unequal outcomes along racial lines, whether it's the way that we have you fill out a form, or the way that communities put themselves together, not understanding that they might be perpetuating some ideologies that are racist. And so that work becomes extremely deep to make the change happen that we want to see.
Can I just add one comment to that? Because I think your point is so important. When we talk about community policing, we have to be clear that it's the entire community, not just those with power and a voice. And that has been the conundrum for community policing, is that you have block watch captains and people that already love the cops and trust the cops participating. And until we get everybody participating, we're going to have people calling for racial profiling type stops, because racism is rampant in the whole community. The police department doesn't have a corner on the market.
Okay, and we've got hands in the audience, but I also want to make sure we're respectful of the folks online. Rex has a question from online. We'll take that, and then we'll come back into the live audience.
Thank you. So there's two questions kind of similar. So when it comes to police discipline at the hands of the legal system, how can the legal system, prosecutors, legislators, etc., adjust to overcome the thin blue line issue? And the second question, what can lawyers do to hold police accountable? I-940 may improve the law somewhat if it passes, but bringing the cases successfully seems to be an uphill climb. Should we be taking more police misconduct cases or focusing on new legislation?
Great questions, and I'm going to defer to Michelle.
Yeah, I can start. So to begin with, in Washington State, I think many people here probably know this, the way the law is situated in terms of police accountability, you have to have a finding of both malice and good faith to be able to hold a police officer accountable to prosecute them, which is a pretty impossible standard to overcome. There was a joint legislative task force of the legislature last year attempting to overcome that. We now have an initiative which is attempting to overcome that as well. So that's the first thing that has to change. The law has to actually make it possible for an officer to be prosecuted. Beyond that, then you have to get the prosecutor to actually do it. And I think people don't really always appreciate how much power prosecutors have in those decisions in our communities, and it's something that we should be thinking about when we are looking at our choices of who will be holding those very important positions. Are they someone who will actually hold not just community members accountable in terms of charging decisions, but police officers or community members as well? So those are a couple of reflections I have on that. Again, it's deep change that has to take place because there tends to be well, right, and then also just one more thing. Sorry, I had too many thoughts colliding in my head all at once. The role of community oversight, I think, could be enhanced. We have very few community oversight bodies. We're fortunate to have the Community Police Commission in Seattle. There's the King County has the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight. Spokane has one, but not all communities have meaningful police oversight that could also help to push police departments and help to push prosecutors as well. So I wanted to throw that out as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other additional comments?
I'll reserve comments.
All right. We're going to move back into the audience, and we've got lots of questions here. One mic in the hand. Go ahead, and then we're going to jump to this side. So go ahead, please.
Michelle had mentioned implicit bias, and certainly we're in a society where we have all of us internalized implicit bias, and even those of us who believe in equity and equality have to be vigilant and don't always win out over implicit bias. And I suspect most of the people in the room have taken the Harvard implicit bias test. If you haven't, look it up online, do it. It's interesting. But Michelle mentioned that Sue is doing something to deal with that, and it strikes me a lot of the a lot of the discriminatory policing may be based in part on implicit bias. What are you doing in your short time to try to get past that with your recruits?
Well, we're doing a couple of things, and in the past year, it's gotten more difficult. You can read between the lines on that. We do training about the scientific concept of implicit bias. When we talk to the recruits, we're very clear with them. We're not going to argue about whether or not you have implicit bias or not. If you have a pulse, you have implicit bias. That's the way your brain is wired. So let's talk about, if you're going to be an effective police officer, you have to be able to look at something and make an assessment. Is this a threat or not? And so we really try to get into the brain science. Unfortunately, what I have watched happening, and this is really troubling, I think, for all of us, is this polarization that's happening in our society. And so many, when I talk about my wonderful millennial recruits, most of them get the majority of their news off of social media. And if you take a look at what's behind the curtain on social media, you have these marketing algorithms that are pulling them further and further apart. So if the artificial intelligence labels you as the type of person that's typically pro-cop, you're going to get a whole bunch of pro-cop stories. And the same way on the other side. If you look like you're against the cops, you're going to get more stories that are against the cops. And so pretty soon, not only do we have the community and the police being driven apart, we have this tribal mentality that, and Norm will validate that policing is a profession that is very tribal. That's just the nature of the profession. And so what we're working on now, in fact, I brought my notes because this program is underway. We're going to do a full day of workshops just talking to recruits about how they are being influenced, not only by social media, but also about this human behavioral draw toward being part of the tribe, before we can even get them to listen to how much they are missing the boat by the way they see things. So we're working very hard on it. It's becoming more and more challenging in the current political environment.
Thanks. Jennifer over here. Hands on this side of the room. There we go. Okay.
Hi, my name is Gabe Goldberg, and I have a question for Sue. I loved what you were saying about expanding the idea or definition of being a police officer to being a guardian of democracy. And I was also curious to know if in doing that, how have the evaluation criteria adjusted for police officers against that idea or mission that have different before, so they can be, perhaps rewarded for different behaviors?
That's a great question, because that is something that I feel we've done successfully in the academy, and now we want to push that out to agency leadership, so we're not counting arrests as a way of measuring effectiveness. And so what we've done, a number of things. We've infused a lot more training on psychology, social, all of these arenas. And when they're graded, we have mock scenarios that they're graded on. And it used to be that every mock scenario ended with either an arrest or a shooting or a physical force being used. We have separated the skill training testing, so you can demonstrate your proficiency with a firearm, but in the mock scenarios, the expectation is that you resolve those without shooting. And we have other scenarios that can be resolved without making an arrest. Now, I can assure you that not everybody agrees with this. Thankfully, I have 14 commissioners appointed by the governor, so far I've been able to keep my job. But it really is what you measure. That's what sets the expectation. So we really are changing that a lot. Crisis intervention training we do 8 hours additional training, and it's infused all the way through the curriculum. So the expectation is, you're not just there to arrest people. I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Any additional comments from the panel? All right, next question. Talia, did you have a question? Hi. Well,
thank you. So my question is for Surar, and it's been discussed a little bit with the implicit bias training, but I'm questioning I'm wondering about what Michelle Storms was saying about the history of this country, the history of policing, and also the racial systems that we have in place. And to what extent are we teaching that history in the academy, so that not just are we teaching them, here's what to do, but also here's where this comes from, and to understand really the narrative that I would have learned in sociology classes that they may not have ever heard of.
So we have expanded our reading list for recruits. I don't yet have the power to require them to do a lot of outside reading because of union rules, and they get paid overtime. I won't go into that too deeply because that's a whole other discussion. But on our reading list, we've included books such as The New Jim Crow, and that has double asterisks. That if you want to understand mass incarceration and social justice, you really have to read that. For those that won't read the book and this workshop series that's coming up, they're going to be required to watch the movie 13 because it covers a lot of the themes that are in The New Jim Crow. And so we're expanding those discussions. In talking about race and policing and getting people, I'm not sure which speaker mentioned this, but the idea that racism, that was something that happened 50 years ago in the South, is countering that to say it doesn't matter who started it. We own that history, whether we personally created it or not. We own that history, and we're responsible about moving forward. And so we want to get our recruits off of the defensiveness and just say, here are the facts that we need to deal with. Talk about, the people you encounter in the community. Some of them over Thanksgiving dinner weren't talking about the same things that my family was. They may have been talking about some very troubling things. So we're trying to infuse more of that into the academy.
Thanks for the question. Additional questions in the very back. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Darnell. Hey, Lim. I have two questions. One, I think, is for Sue. I think you said that you don't pick the people who are your recruits. They're picked by someone or something else and sent to you.
The chiefs or the sheriffs hire them.
But do they select the people who get sent to the academy to become recruits? So it's the chief of police and the sheriff.
Correct.
Who does that. All right. The other question I had, maybe this is beyond what you do, either Sue or anybody else there, but the people I've heard you talking about are the millennials, the recruits. What about the people who are already police officers, as far as their training or their being, I don't want to say confronted, but brought to their attention, these issues of implicit bias, like you said, but also actual circumstances, actual cases where police officers on the SPD have, they've done things that some of us have real questions about, but how do you, is anyone doing anything with the men and the women who are already on the force, already on the beat or whatever? Because right now, as far as a lot of things that happen, these are the people who are either doing it or being accused of doing it. So that's where my question really is.
So you have hit on our very biggest challenge. Frankly, it's pretty easy to train the new puppies because they're like sponges. They're going to listen to what we say. What we have done is our training officer cadre, instead of pretending to be drill sergeants, they're required to act as role models. So that has been helpful. We have revamped the training that we give to field training officers. So these are the senior officers in the field that train the new cops coming out of the academy, and they have about a 4 to 6 month period where they ride along with the senior officer. That's our next focus, is on that group of officers to get them to reinforce the philosophy we're teaching in the academy. That has been very difficult to do. The other thing that I'm very, very optimistic about, I got a substantial grant from Microsoft, which was thankfully matched by our state legislature, which has been very supportive. We are building a leadership development program that focuses on all leadership within the organization from first level up to chief. And the purpose of that is to talk about changing the culture. And we're just a couple of months into it, but we're already getting some pretty good feedback. Now, to change the culture totally is going to take a generation, but we're doing everything we can to get the momentum built up.
If I could add something to that, my experience is that culture, any workplace culture, but let's deal with the police department, is a function of its structure. And as long as that structure remains paramilitary, bureaucratic, top-down, a rigid system of communication, command and control, all that other language, as long as that structure is in place, what we will continue to get is police officers who are doing what they've been taught to do. So those senior officers, maybe with 3 years on, maybe with 30 years on, are doing what has, in fact, been taught to them. Some of it at the academy, some of it in service training, most of it, frankly, in the locker room or the front seat of a police car. So if a senior officer says to a junior officer, that's not, I know they taught you to do that in the academy, that's not the way we do it out here on the streets. That will not change, I'm convinced, unless citizens become an integral part of the law enforcement agency. You will see citizens moving about freely, participating with police officers in all these areas of problem solving and decision making and the like. And that's an authentic partnership. And it makes it less likely, I think, that police officers will feel this attitude. We're the cops and you're not. So we know what to do.
Are you saying that, pardon me, okay. Are you saying, Chief, that with respect to the superstructure you described, levels of command all the way up to the chief, that you would have civilians, non-police persons, citizens, actively involved with each level in that particular structure to see if you can bring into play a lot more the kind of culture, more people, if you will, more people from the community actually involved in the police department, its internals and that kind of thing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Michelle, your thoughts?
Just really quickly, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about culture change and when you talk about that needing to be at all levels of the organization. And, we had this wonderful 21st century policing task force that really laid out some hugely important concepts and really talked about ways that change could happen. And the guiding principle behind all of that was sanctity of life, right? As such a key thing that if that's what drives you, and that's what you're trying to preserve at all times, that's going to make a huge difference. I wanted to just quickly share that one of the communities that I've worked with since I've been at the ACLU is in Pasco, where back in 2015, there was a terrible police killing of Antonio Zambrano, who was, again, a person of color. Again, there was an issue of a mental health crisis taking place. He was throwing rocks. A couple of things happened out of that. There was a very huge community uproar. Many community members remained dedicated to working with the police agency to seek change. And what we've seen now 2 years later is they have actually adopted a new use of force policy that is very, very detailed in the way in which de-escalation is set forth and favored and absolutely what is being rewarded. But more importantly than them adopting a very good policy, and it is a very good policy, is that they have revamped their training around the use of the policy, and the sergeant who leads the training there for that law enforcement agency is absolutely dedicated to making that change with everyone that because they have the ways in which they regularly provide ongoing training for folks there. So those are some of the ways that it can make a difference, right? You have something that is in writing that is the right thing, but then you have to have people really buy into that and make that be the way they look at the way they're going to do the work. And so I just sort of point that out as something that gives me some hope, because I see them really seeking to use a very unfortunate incident, and again, working very closely with community members throughout this whole process to change the way they're doing it and to build that in and embed that into their training.
Thanks, Michelle. We have time, just enough time for probably one more question.
Hi, my name's Christy Knips. I have a question for the entire panel. What role do you think the police labor unions have in improving the relationship between the police and the community, and not just the racial communities, the minority communities, but the entire community?
It's a huge role. I'll just leave it at that.
I've written in my first book that I come from labor. And I'll get goosebumps and teary-eyed if I listen to another version of Joe Hill. I mean, that's who I am. Police unions represent the footnote. They are a pernicious embarrassment to any law enforcement reform effort. And they need to be contested. They need to be confronted. And there are many, I'm going to say there are many, there are some examples of police unions who've said, we now begin to see how this is in our interest too. They embrace this notion of the sanctity of human life. Individual cops, I heard one recently say, let me tell you something. I knew growing up in the police system that if I had to shoot and kill someone, and I did that I would get nothing but support. However much opposition or criticism from out there in the real world, I would get nothing but support from my brothers and sisters, and I can't tell you how much that means to me. And I thought, okay, I get that, but what about, and this is the officer I wanted to quote, said, I have a personal ethic. My ethic is every single time I suit up and I take the streets, nobody dies tonight. Nobody. I make it home to my family. You hear that all the time from law enforcement. Why wouldn't you? Nobody wants to die. So let's assume for the moment that you've got officers who are saying and embracing this ethic. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that on this next call, on this next shift for an entire career, nobody dies on my watch. That's a fairly simple attitude adjustment that I think police officers can make. But it needs to really be reinforced, that it becomes an ethic for the entire organization and the community as well.
Thanks, Norm. All right, as the moderator, I see we're under 60 seconds left. I want to thank everybody for being here. It has been very interesting, and I think we've covered a bevy of issues that are very significant and important. We haven't solved any problems, but we've had a good discussion, and I want to leave this with giving Michelle the final word on any thoughts on that last question or otherwise that you'd like to share with us in the next 30 seconds.
One thing we didn't get a chance to talk about an awful lot relates to crisis intervention and to mental health. And one of the things that I know has been looked at in some law enforcement agencies are different collaborations with mental health professionals, either coming out on calls with them or consulting in some various ways. So I would throw that out. Whenever we're interdisciplinary and whatever the practice is, we have the potential to be so much stronger. And so I think that might also be something that would be good for us to have.
Thank you. Thanks to each of the panelists. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And if you have additional questions, as long as they will stay, they will continue to answer questions. Thank you.